Hey everybody, this is Ryan Keith, and I did Chapter 5 from the American Education text, which was Equality in Education. And I thought it would be best to present it in a PowerPoint so I can include some visuals. And I apologize for the quality. I had to film it on my iPod, and that's why the vertical lines there going through the picture. But I think it should be fine. I'm going to go ahead and get started with a little history of inequality. I'm going to start with the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which is a famous case from 1896 in which Homer Plessy went to court over the segregation of certain aspects of the transportation system. He actually went to court over segregation on trains, but it was ultimately ruled that separate but equal facilities were constitutional, and I'll talk about this again in just a moment. Another couple of significant cases were Takao Ozawa versus the United States, and the United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind, who is pictured there on the bottom left. And these two cases occurred in the early 1920s and basically resulted in the definition of race being altered in the courts to exclude anyone but white males from being accepted for citizenship. And obviously this did not remain the case forever, but at this time the court's ruling would stay in effect for several decades. And I just want to include this slide here. Some of the problems historically and currently with racial identifiers are that many people from different countries identify themselves as different races or different ethnic groups than we see them here in the United States. For example, 87% of Americans born in Cuba and 53% born in Mexico classify themselves as white, while we may not see them that way. That is how they classify themselves in the census. And immigrants from the Dominican Republic use the most racial identifiers of people from any nation. There's a diversity of ethnic backgrounds in the country, and as you can see from the little pie chart, 73% of Dominicans are of mixed ethnic group, which can result in a lot of confusion, and the Dominican Republic is by no means the only example of this. It's just one that I found that illustrates the point that it is very difficult to define race, and sometimes it can be sort of hazardous to even try to define race. But before the Civil Rights Act was passed, which I'll talk about in a moment, a lot of times courts would try to define race, and usually they would do a very poor job of doing so. Next thing I'd like to talk about is the 1965 Immigration Act, which abolished the quota system. The quota system had basically been in place before this. It was a system that only allowed a certain number of immigrants into the country from other countries, but only dealt with immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere nations, mostly Asia. And generally the quota for how many immigrants could enter per year were extremely low, and the Immigration Act changed that. It allowed the United States to accept immigrants from around the world, and that resulted in a large influx of Asian immigrants in the late 60s and 70s, and that continues to this day. And right there in that picture is President Johnson signing the act into law. We go to talk about the 14th Amendment now. Go back to the Plessy versus Ferguson case. The 14th Amendment granted equal protection to all U.S. citizens, and this was known as the Equal Protection Clause. This clause was construed in the Plessy versus Ferguson case to allow separate but equal schools, and And as you can see there on the bottom left, let me move in here, that is a supposedly equal school for African American children. I believe that's from the 1950s, but obviously you can see that's in terrible condition. There's a chalkboard that is broken in half, the furnace is broken, closet door broken, and just in general it's a mess. And this is one of the problems inherent with separate but equal. Generally, equality was not guaranteed because the white schools usually got the majority of the funding and the majority of the attention, while schools for blacks were usually in this sort of condition. Let me move to the next slide here. The major changing force in all this was the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling, and it's certainly one of the most significant court rulings in American history for civil rights. It ruled that separate but equal was unconstitutional because separate schools and separate facilities were inherently unequal. And as a result, this case brought about some long-term benefits, not only for African Americans but also for other ethnic minorities and other groups such as women. I'll discuss in just a moment. And right there in the picture are two lawyers with Thurgood Marshall. And there's just a newspaper headline from 1954 stating that segregation was ended by the court. And this ruling actually came from, this case actually originated in Kansas, which is not particularly a place that you would associate with civil rights and the civil rights movement, but in this case it was. And another major aspect of civil rights was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, particularly Title IV of this act, which denied federal funding to institutions that discriminated based on race. And this essentially forced the desegregation of schools because schools and other government facilities that refused to desegregate would not be given government funding, and without funding most of these places cannot survive. So that was a major decision, and eventually led to the desegregation of American schools. And on the bottom left there is Dr. Martin Luther King shaking hands with President Johnson as he signed the Civil Rights Act into law. One case I'd like to mention briefly is Oliver versus the Michigan State Board of Education, which essentially said that in order for segregation to be present, in order for funds to be denied, there had to be a pattern of segregation, and that it could not be based simply upon one or two isolated incidences. And this case occurred in the early 1970s, and it served to sort of clarify what desegregation actually meant and what discrimination actually entailed in American schools. And today, school segregation actually remains a problem. It's not as institutionalized as it used to be. That is, many laws obviously prevent segregation now, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't still go on. And mainly it's a result of residential segregation, which I will explain a little bit on the next slide. And that's just, segregation is defined today as minority students who attend schools that are 50 to 100% minorities. Generally this occurs in inner city areas, urban areas, in major cities, but it can occur in a variety of locations. Another type of segregation that goes on today is second-generation segregation. This occurs when students are misplaced purposefully into special education classes. This is thought to sometimes, or it does sometimes, result in extra funding being allocated to the schools with more students in special education, and is usually done by poverty-stricken schools that have a lack of funding and have really no other means to get the funding, but it results in students being placed in classes apart from other students where they, when they in fact don't actually belong in those classes and do not actually need special attention. And going back to residential segregation, here is a map of New York City. Now, residential segregation occurs in many large cities. There were a large number of these maps made, excuse me, of pretty much every major city in the United States. But as you can see, the different colors represent different ethnic groups, or different races, I should say, in New York City and the different boroughs. And blue is white. The reddish color is African Americans, and the sort of greenish yellow color are Hispanics. And as you can see, the different ethnic groups are often clustered into particular areas, and that's what's meant by residential segregation. This sort of segregation, obviously, students attend schools near where they live, so residential segregation results in schools being segregated, meaning that different minorities, different ethnic groups attend one school or the other, and oftentimes they don't associate with students from other ethnic groups, and that is certainly a form of segregation, and is the most prevalent form of segregation today in the United States. Next up, equality for women in education. This is an indirect result of the Civil Rights Act. Women looked at the Civil Rights Act and wanted equality of their own in school and in other aspects of society. As a result, the National Organization for Women was founded in the mid-1960s. This resulted in many different laws being passed that gave more equality for women in schools. One of the most important of these was Title IX in 1972, that made it illegal to segregate students into different classes based on their gender. And of course, this resulted in many improvements for girls in schools and much more equality. And not only did it result in more equality in schools, but it also resulted in equality outside of school once these girls graduated. And it resulted in more women in college, and it resulted in more women in a diversity of professions. And this graph here illustrates some of those points. In 1972, girls only made up 4% of students playing high school sports, but today they make up over 40%. In 72, the women only made up 9% of the medical degrees earned, and today they make up roughly 43%. And in 1972, women only made up roughly 7% of the law degrees earned, and today they make up nearly half, 47%, which are all quite impressive improvements brought about by the women's equality movement in the 1960s and the 1970s. and particularly the National Organization for Women. And I'm going to move to disabled children in schools now. A major case that occurred in the late 1960s was Park versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This essentially exposed the somewhat terrible conditions often experienced by handicapped children in schools, and eventually it brought about the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, which promoted the equal education for handicapped children, and in fact made it illegal to discriminate against children because of a disability. This act has been changed, I assume because of political correctness. It was changed in the early 1990s to the Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA, which is a more catchy name, I suppose. And it continues to promote equality in education for handicapped, disabled children in schools. One way in which this is accomplished is through inclusion, which is allowing, or in some cases requiring, students with disabilities to participate in classes with children who are not disabled. This is thought to benefit the disabled children socially and also educationally, because it is believed that they have more interactions with non-disabled children, and that teachers who are teaching regular classrooms can provide the disabled children with the education that they need. Oftentimes, though, schools will appoint each disabled student with some sort of advisor or helper who will, as shown in this picture here, who will help the disabled student out in the classroom and take some of the pressure off of the regular classroom teacher. And inclusion is a policy that is debated among educators. Many of them do not support inclusion because they believe that disabled children are not prepared to be in a classroom with regular children. Some of them believe that it's a distraction, and also some educators are not completely prepared to teach disabled children, and so they are reluctant to have them in their classroom. And this is definitely a valid point. Some disabled children need more help than others, and especially in poor school districts that receive less funding, oftentimes the individual disabled students don't have access to helpers, which means that a lot of times all of the teaching is placed upon the normal classroom teacher, and this can be a little bit much to handle sometimes. And I'm just going to show this graph here. This is going along with the concept of inclusion. This is just telling where students with disabilities spend their day, and this graph shows that 48% of students, and as of 2004, this graph is about 10 years old, but it's still relevant. It shows that 48% of disabled students spend more than 80% of the day in a regular educational classroom. 29% of disabled students spend at least 40% of the day in a regular education classroom, and only 23% of disabled students spend more than 60% of the day outside a regular education classroom, meaning that the trend now is to include disabled students in the regular classroom in order to develop them and to help them to associate with non-disabled children, and it's hoped that this will help them learn more quickly, and that they can make friends and feel like they're being treated equally. And this basically concludes my lecture. I'd just like to say that schools are not completely equal today. Obviously, the opportunities are not equal to everyone in American schools, but things have definitely improved, especially since the 60s and 70s. And from the readings, I gathered that I believe that things can continue to improve as long as we continue to work towards achieving equality. And I'm just going to turn the camera around, prove that I'm actually here. Sorry about that. And I just want to thank everybody for watching, and I look forward to seeing your presentations.